Welcome to Corks and Conversation with Don Bentley.
Yes, I'm so excited to be talking with him, Kathy. I loved his book, and I'm just fascinated by his pre writing life, which sounds like he lived one of his characters or something.
Well, spy thrillers, international intrigue is it's my jam. I'm super excited. I've been a long time fan of the Jack Ryan series, so this is a real privilege for me.
Yes, yes, me too. And this one's set in Korea, which is a little scary since my daughter lives there, but I'm glad it's fiction. It's a little realistic, but I'm glad it's fiction.
Yeah, we'll have to ask him about that. I'm sure he'll make you feel much, much better. Or not. I don't know. Okay, so let me start off by telling you a little bit about Don's. Yes, if you're watching on YouTube, Christy has a copy, I do too, of this latest cover of Zero Hour. Um, I do want to talk about Don a little bit because I really want our listeners to understand what he's bringing to this series and what kind of guy he is. So, Don is the New York Times bestselling author of the Matt Drake thriller series that he writes on his own. And then he also writes the Tom Clancy Jack Ryan Jr. books, which we're going to be talking about today, which the latest is Zero Hour. But Don, prior to that, spent a decade as an Army Apache helicopter pilot, during which time he was stationed in South Korea, the setting of today's book, Germany, and Texas. While deployed to Afghanistan as a troop commander in support of Operation Enduring Freedom, Don was awarded the Bronze Star Medal and the Air Medal with a V device for valor. Following his time in the military, Don continued to serve our country by working as an FBI special agent and a member of the Dallas Office Special Weapons and Tactics, which is the SWAT team. After leaving the FBI, Don worked for companies he continued to serve that developed technology for the United States Special Operations community. He holds a bachelor's degree in electrical and computer engineering from The Ohio State University and an MFA in writing popular fiction from Seton Hall. So, all of that, Don, welcome to the conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me, and I appreciate you put the in the Ohio State
I know
University.
that.
So thank you.
You have to. I know that much. I do.
It's trademarked now, isn't it? I think.
That's right.
It's a big deal. If you know, you know. It's a big deal.
Yeah, well, before we get started, we're going to talk about what we're drinking today because we're all over the place. We're normally just wine, but we're doing everything today. So I guess Don has a beer from a local brewery in Texas,
Yep.
And it's kind of coffee.
It's called
and
the
beer.
Trail Runner. That's right. That's Trail Runner from a local brewery here.
Cool. We'll give them a shout out.
Kathy's drinking red wine of her
my
choice.
Usual. Yep, I'm having
and
a little red.
am going totally in for the book, and I have
you are brave.
The South Korean. This is the spirit of choice. Honestly, this is what they say of Korea. But and no brand is more popular than Jinro, which is the one that I'm drinking, and I happen to find in Total Wine down here. And this, Kathy, you're going to be even more surprised when you hear this, that this not only is the country's best-selling soju, but it's the world's top-selling spirit.
What?
Wow.
That's what the internet told me.
No.
They told me. Started in 1924. They drink a lot of it in Korea. And it can be a wide range. Like, it's usually originally made from rice, and it can be a wide range, like, of alcohol content. And they, like, my daughter got them when she came back. She went and bought, like, apple flavor, this is like the original flavor. So, but you can mix it with stuff, or this is, I don't know what the percentage is. This is 20%. So that's why I'm drinking it.
Well, Don and I'll just have a conversation.
Little tiny, well, look at, I'm spilling it. Little tiny shot glass because it's very strong. But I'm gonna have a little sip.
Okay, well let's raise a toast to Don with your teeny tiny shot glass.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Oh,
Love it.
right.
That's great.
All right. So
You
now
better
that we've
sit.
got that out of the way, let's talk about the book.
Yes.
This book
Yes.
is it's Tom Clancy 0 Hour. So it features Jack Ryan Jr., which I'm sure everybody knows who Jack Ryan is. So that's his son. And it's very exciting. It's just, it's a great, like, oh my gosh, page turner. And it's set where the leader of North Korea is injured and he's incapacitated. And so, all hell's breaking loose because, everybody wants to take over. And and so it kind of starts a war, or they're trying to start a war with South Korea and mess with the US and Russia at the same time. I mean, there's all kinds of intrigue. And then Jack Ryan Jr., he just happens to be there, and he's going to save the day, hopefully. But in the process, there's a lot going on, and he works for something called what? The campus? I
The
think?
campus. Yep.
The
I
campus.
love
It's
that.
like this secret organization that, of course, we don't know about. And then there's all kinds of there's helicopters, which I'm sure Don knows inside and out. So they're coming in, and there's all these, and it's really, really a fun, little bit scary for me because my daughter's there read, but I just, I loved it. I love the intrigue and everything. And but that's where I want to start in the questions, because I mean, the coup that's happened, everything, it seems, of course, you're going to make it that way. Seems very realistic, but tell me, I mean, is this like entirely fiction, or should I be a little worried? Where does this come
Yeah.
from?
Yeah, you should be terrified, is what I'm going to tell you, and for a couple different reasons. So, for one, my Matt Drake book, my last one called Hostile Intent, that just came out in May. I wrote that a year ago, and when I was writing that a year ago, I was thinking, what could I do on European soil that would be fun to show kind of a big military thriller-esque thing? And I thought, what about a Russian invasion of Ukraine? Well, I'll do that because there's no way that's going to happen. So a
What?
year ago, I wrote that. And then there's the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So now that I've written about North Korea invading South Korea, you should get your daughter home now, is what I'm telling you. No.
Wow. Okay. Wow. Let's
I
talk a
know.
little bit about the Mac Drake novels.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
Sure.
tell us about that.
Yeah, so Hostile Intent is the third book in my Matt Drake series. And so what I wanted to do with this book, much like I did with Hostile Intent, is Tom Clancy is I say he's kind of my gateway drug to the thriller universe. Because when I was about 14, my neighbor up the street was a year or two older than me and had much more, let's say, permissible parents than I did. And he would smuggle me these Tom Clancy books. And the first one he gave me was Red Storm Rising, which was Tom's version of a big, like, epic World War III book. And so I remember reading that and feeling there's this scene where an F-14, which was the original airplane from Top Gun, is doing this strafing run on a Russian container ship. And I just remember feeling like I was there and thinking, man, I would love to be able to write books like that. And so when I got the chance, like I said, Hostile Intent is the third book in my Matt Drake series. My first two books dealt with problem sets in the Middle East. And so I really wanted to set a book in Europe. And my last assignment in the Army was in Germany. And so as part of that, I was sitting in my cubicle and the soldier next to me was training for a triathlon. And he said, "Hey, let's go run a marathon." And I said, "That's a terrible idea." And he said, "We'll do it in Vienna." And I'm like, "I'm in." And so we went to Vienna and ran a marathon. And yes, exactly. And so that's where the book kicks off. And so I knew I wanted to set it in Europe. And I thought, what kind of epic, big, conventional military thriller could I show in Europe? And so I had the idea of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so some of that, when you're in the military, there's a job that you often do, and it's called the S2, or the intelligence officer. And so that person's job, his or her job, is to play the part of the enemy commander. And so what that means is he or she briefs you as the commander as, here's what the enemy forces are going to look like, here's what they're going to do, here's how I expect their order of march to be. And then before you do the actual operation, you actually create this huge terrain board that looks like where the operation is going to take place. And all the commanders and leaders actually walk out on this ground and say, okay, now I'm going to go to this hill. Here's what my primary task and purpose is going to be. And the S2, the intelligence officer, does the same thing, but they play the enemy. And they say, okay, here is how I'm going to attack. Here's how I'm going to react to what you've done. And so it very much teaches you to view the world through your enemy's eyes. So that's a super useful skill for a thriller writer to have, because once I figured out, hey, I want the battlefield to be Europe, I want it to be a Russian invasion of Ukraine, I was able to come up with a lot of things that were pretty similar to how the Russians did their invasion. Now, that the biggest thing that I got wrong, that I think the entire world got wrong, is I vastly underestimated the courageousness and bravery of the Ukrainian people that you still see. But it really was a surreal moment, because it's something that I wrote about a year ago, and then you watch it come to fruition. And on one hand, you're like, okay, I got this part right. And then on the other hand, you're like, this isn't a book anymore. This is real life. People are dying, and it's horrific. But it very much was. I finished that in the summer of 2021, and it came out in May. And then obviously the Russian invasion happened just before that. So hopefully not the same thing for the Korea book for 0 Hour.
Yes, please. I know. Well, that was so interesting too, that your books came out so close together. I mean, I'm kind of jumping ahead in our questions, but
whatever.
Well, that's one of the things I'm lucky about from the placement of the books, is that so I write the Matt Drake series, like I said, and my editor, there's a lot of Toms in this story, so I apologize. My editor is called Tom Colgan, and he edited Tom Clancy when Clancy was still alive, and he's edited everybody from like Janet Ivanovich to Lee Child and kind of everybody in between.
Oh, wow.
And so when I turned in the second book of my series, which was called The Outside Man, at the end of the editorial conversation, and that very much feels like you're in fourth grade and you've forgotten your homework, because you're going in, and that's when you get to figure out what the editor really thinks of your book. And it was this great conversation, and at the very end of it, he did a Columbo on me, and he's like, just one more thing, would you be interested in writing the Tom Clancy books? And I was like, what did he just say? And so as part of that, what's fun is, because it's the same editor for both book series, what they try and do is put my book really close to the Clancy book, because everybody in the world knows who Tom Clancy is. And what they kind of hope is that those readers read his book and then kind of go back to see mine. And that works in various amounts of effectiveness. When I was going through the airport traveling, I found a bunch of my Clancy books at one of the airport bookstores. And so I told the lady, I was like, hey, do you want me to sign these? And she's like, yeah. And then she goes, Tom Clancy's here.
No.
Screams, and I'm like, no, it's just me.
Really? It's not.
It's just me. So some pluses and minuses there, I guess.
That's funny. Well, I'm definitely. I was going to say, Cathi, we're probably definitely going to go read the Matt Drake one now, for sure.
I am.
So
totally,
it is connecting. So I know. Okay.
I got two more sales. Yes.
Yeah.
I will
put it on your Christmas list,
right?
Yes.
One of my favorite writers is Daniel Silva, who writes.
Me too.
Yeah, I love him, and he has a track record of kind of predicting events, and so it sounds like you're in good company doing that. Although none of us really appreciate you doing that.
It's not going to happen, because I talked to my daughter in length. I haven't read her paper that she just wrote about relations, but she feels like they progressed enough that their North Koreans aren't completely all brainwashed because they've smuggled in stuff. I don't know. Okay. I'm hoping that it's not quite as, because it's just scary the way that, and she did tell me about a movie that she was watching. I don't know if you've heard of it, Red Family. And it's about spies from North Korea coming down and as a
Yeah.
family, or pretend
Yeah. Yeah.
family. And I just watched like 5 minutes of it earlier today, and I was like, "Ooh, creepy!
Yeah.
These people."
Yeah. So South Korea was my first duty assignment right out of flight school, and it was the late 90s. And so back then, getting assigned to Korea is kind of the closest you could get to combat, because it was before September 11th, before all of those things. And I don't mean to imply that people were shooting at each other, because they weren't,
You saw my heart going like this. Oh yeah, closest to camp. Okay, go ahead.
but
Sorry.
there is still an active war there, from the standpoint of, it was only ever an armistice that was signed. There's no peace treaty between North and South Korea. And so what that looked like in the 90s is, every so often North Korea would shell one of South Korea's islands, or sometimes their navies would mix it up. Or actually, right before I got there, they call them midget subs. They're very small submarines that are used to ferry North Korean commandos into South Korea. And I actually wrote about that in the book a little bit. And a North Korean midget sub ran aground in South Korea, and the commandos in that submarine were running across South Korea causing trouble, and they had to hunt them down, and there are all kinds of gunfights and stuff.
Oh,
and so at one point, there was actually, when North Korea and South Korea were mixing it up in the ocean again, we were throwing hellfires on the Apaches, because we thought we were going to go to war mission, go do a show of force. And so it very much was, we used to call it freedom's frontier. It very much was the wild, wild west. And it may have dampened down some, and it certainly isn't the focus like it was back then, because September 11th and Iraq and everything changed all of that. But it's still pretty froggy over there, because you have a crazy guy who is in charge of a nation and has a nuclear weapon at its fingertips. And so it is still
Scary.
very much, for sure. So it is definitely right for novels and spy thrillers, for sure.
Okay, so let's talk about the Jack Ryan character a little bit.
Yep.
I have not read a Clancy novel that featured Jack Ryan Jr. until yours. So I was like, oh, like a whole new, like, I was so excited. But I loved his character, because
thank you.
He's got some challenging romantic issues
Yeah.
going on, which was a really fun aspect. Trying to live under his parents' shadow, obviously.
Yep.
And he's this really kind of strapping, large guy in Korea, which is a really fun juxtaposition. He kind of reminded me of, like, like a Jack Reacher character, like that would stick out right in Korea. I loved that whole.
Thank you.
I'm into it. I'm going back to read all of them now. So
no, I was going to say, it's really interesting, because he is, as a character, what I tell folks, a lot of people say the exact same thing that you have, but have seen like the Amazon series and then want to jump into the books. And the problem with the books is that iconic Jack Ryan Sr. character that John Krasinski plays in the books is actually in his 70s or late 60s, early 70s, and is president of the United States. And so what I tell people is, the John Krasinski character is the same age as my character. That's his son. And so if you think of it that way, that's a little easier entry point. But he's a really interesting character in that everybody else he associates with all have the resume to do what they do. So for instance, John Clark was a SEAL in Vietnam. Ding Chavez was an infantryman and did a bunch of work in and the only thing Jack Ryan Jr. has is his name. His name is Ryan, and so he gets to be one of those secret squirrel guys too, and is constantly has been trying to prove himself and to become worthy of kind of the trust that these older kind of experienced guys do it. And so when I got offered the chance to write this book, when I had the conversation with my editor, and I started this, my first book in the Clancy universe was Target Acquired, that came out last year. And this was very much of a continuation of that, because I said, what it feels like to me is kind of like an Avengers movie. When you had just Iron Man, that was just Robert Downey Jr., you got to dive into him and kind of figure out how he works. But when he's got 12 other sidekicks on the screen with him, you don't get as deep a dive into his personality and stuff. And so what I asked to do is can I take and just focus on Jack Ryan Jr. and kind of figure out what makes him tick and why he does what he was, and just do a deeper dive into that. And my editor went for it. And so it was a lot of fun. And then as being a writer, what was super fun is most of the characters, all the pilots except for one, are real people that I flew with. A lot of the special operations folks are real people, but I reversed them all. And so my friend Brandon Cates, who plays a Navy SEAL in this, is actually an Army Ranger. And my friend Jad, who's a Green Beret, is actually a Navy SEAL, and I made him a Green Beret. And so these are like all the fun little tricks you get to play on people as a writer. Oh, I hated it. So it was I actually, you know, make fun of him in the book and say, man, you're a lot like a SEAL. You use hair gel, you wear pretty boy clothes. And so he was very good natured about it, but it was a lot of fun.
Okay, I want to dive into more how this all works. Let's have a drink, and then we're going to do the question in the bottle. It's kind of our midway question for you. Christie's going to give you a random question. They're pretty random, about kind of what you might want to get to at the end of a bottle.
All right.
Oh, this is funny. Have you ever pretended to speak a foreign language that you don't know?
I wouldn't say pretended, but we lived in Germany for 3 years and South Korea for 2. And so in Europe, they have this joke that if you speak 3 languages, you're called trilingual. If you speak 2 languages, you're called bilingual. And if you speak 1 language, you're called an American. And that is absolutely true. And so I would learn like please and thank you in about 3 or 4 different languages, or excuse me, and then see how far I could get. So they wouldn't think I was an American, hopefully. So that's the closest way I think I can answer that.
I mean, I think I would be like,
have you ever done that?
Of course I have. When I was little, we used to do it all the time. You know, we'd just be in like the store and pretend we're speaking a foreign language. Back then, you know, there was so like my sister and I would be like,
you were speaking?
Oh, I don't know.
Like a made up language, or
yeah, it's kind of made up language, and you know, it would be funny. And then I do remember, like, you know, when I was in Europe, I would just pretend like I was. Like if somebody thought, you know, I was an American and was giving me a hard time, I'd just pretend like I spoke another language other than French, or, you know, I'd be like, oh yeah, I'm Scandinavian or something. You know, I'd be like, oh no, English. Whatever.
Oh my God.
If you can't pull that off, you can always pretend to be Canadian, because everybody loves Canadians. So just go with that.
So that was the other one. I would do either, and I had a sweatshirt that said Australia, which I've never been to, and I'd be like, "Oh, I'm Australian, yeah."
That's awesome.
Anyway.
Okay, so I want to know how daunted you were when you got the invitation to even consider joining this immense franchise, this just huge thing.
Yeah, I think what I tell people is when I got the offer, I felt like two emotions, overpowering emotions at the same time. And so one was excitement and the other was absolute and abject terror. And because you're thinking, you know, I could be the guy that runs this franchise into the ground. Like that could be me. I'd be the one that take this plane. And so fortunately, the people who, you know, were members past and present of the Clancy universe are some incredible folks. So Mark Graney is a great friend of mine. He has the incredible series, The Gray Man, which comes out on Netflix, I think this month, which is pretty amazing. But he fielded more late night texts and phone calls and stuff than I would care to admit. And was a fantastic guy. Mark Cameron, who writes the series at the same time, Mike Madden, all of those people. But the best person was my editor, was Tom Colgan, because once I agreed to do it, he said, you know what, here's what I want you to remember is that you're not Tom Clancy. Nobody can be Tom Clancy. He's like, I don't want you to try. He said, I just want you to do what you do, but do it in his universe. And so that kind of gave me some credit, or not some credit, but some confidence. And the other thing he said is because in addition to the Clancy franchise, he has the Robert Ludlum franchises, the W.B. Griffin, like all of these legacy franchises, and he said, this is what I want you to know. He said, I'm really, really good at finding the right writers for the right series. And he's like, you're the writer for this series. That's all you need to know. And so, doing that, and then having him with my Matt Drake books too. I just handed in my 4th Matt Drake book, but it's the 6th book that he and I have worked on together. And so there's a tremendous amount of trust now, I think, that we have between us. And there's a really good friend of mine named John Dixon, who's a great writer too, was a Golden Glove boxer. And he told me once that the job of a referee in a boxing match is to make sure that nobody gets hurt. And he said, so when you're fighting, you never have to worry about hurting the other person, because that's the referee's job. He is going to make sure you don't hurt anybody. You just fight the very hardest that you can fight. And so from a writing perspective, what I really feel like is that Tom is like that referee, or like the guardrails. And so I'll go crazy, which I often do. And then I know that he'll kind of dial me back and put such kind and affirming editorials as, this is too much 80s music. You cannot have another White Snake song, which I'm still a little bitter about. But that's the kind of feedback he gives me in the books and stuff. And so it really is a good partnership.
So is Tom, like, does he have any background in military, espionage, whatever? He just happens to really be able to edit that.
Yeah.
And what
Yeah,
do you,
none
and
of
so
that.
you have it all. You do have a lot of
Yeah.
it anyway. But do you still have to
Sure.
go out and talk to, some of the different professionals or different areas to get it right?
Yeah, absolutely. And since 9/11 and the war on terror and everything, there are a lot of writers in this genre now who do have experience. Having said that, Tom Clancy was an insurance salesman with a library card. And so he had zero. If you look at some of the top writers at the turn of the century, so you got Tom Clancy with zero. Brad Thor was a travel writer. Vince Flynn was a bartender. Mark Greaney had a master's in international relations and stuff like that. Daniel Silva, I think, was a journalist or something before he came out and did that. And so it's very much, you don't need to have it. Now, what you do need to have, I think, is that curiosity, and then some people that you can talk to. And so my wife, I got to do a lot of fun things, and my wife all the time just says it was because I couldn't figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up, which is mostly true. But the first book in my series that came out was called Without Sanction. And when I was doing press for it, a radio interviewer, it was like she was going to do the gotcha question. And she said, "Are you Matt Drake?" And I said, I am absolutely not Matt Drake, but I've stood in the same room with him before. And that is true.
Wow,
and so cool. I have this series of very interesting people that I've been lucky enough to meet that I can come back and say, hey, this is the scene I'm working on. Can you help me with it? Or, what kind of equipment would they use, or what? And in my last book, in Hostile Intent, there's a scene where there's a big ambush that happens, and I'm literally drawing on a map and sending sheets of paper back and forth between me and a guy who retired as a sergeant major from the Delta Force, and he's fixing my ambush and giving me feedback and stuff on it.
Oh,
and
wow.
So I think it certainly is helpful to have a background sort of like mine, but it's more, I feel like mine is more, it helps me know what I don't know and then figure out who I can talk to in order to fill in the gaps.
Oh. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so one thing I'm circling us back here to the beginning of our conversation. When you were reading those Tom Clancy books as a 14-year-old about the fighter pilots, did that help your interest in going into the military?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think, wow. People, they say that the original Top Gun movie increased the number of folks who wanted to be naval pilots by 500%. The recruiting went from year over year. And I think Tom Clancy absolutely did the same thing for those of us who grew up kind of in that Cold War era, watching movies like Red Dawn or something like that. You're like, how do we do this? And he laid out such a compelling view of what it was like, or what it could be like, or something. I mean, the majority of folks that I served with all grew up reading Tom Clancy. And I don't mean to say that he was the sole reason we did that. But I think you read that and like, man, the way he depicted the military, because if you remember before that, there were a lot of books, and I don't want to throw stones, but there were a lot of books coming out of Vietnam that were very much reactionary to an unpopular war, that gave a very negative depiction of the military and what life in the military was like. And Tom Clancy really threw that on its head and said, hey, this can be something that's noble, that it's a profession of arms, that there are people who are all volunteer Army, all volunteer military, that you're serving shoulder to shoulder with. And he really changed the dynamic on that, I think.
Wow. Okay, I know Christy's got a question, and if you don't, I want to ask it.
Go ahead. I know we were both going. I'm like, go ahead.
Done?
Yeah, that was probably my question, a little bit differently worded.
What was it? I didn't hear you.
How do you get all this writing done? I mean, how are you writing both
she said
simultaneously?
How the hell do you get all this writing done?
Somebody, people have asked me in interviews before, how many hours a day do you write? And I say every single one of them is my answer. And so right now, like I said, I'm lucky enough to be able to write 2 series, but what it means is I have to turn in a book every 5 months. And so I go straight from like a Matt Drake book to a Tom Clancy book to a Matt Drake book. And so some of it is having, I think some of it, especially with the Clancy books, is having something that's interesting in the series that you feel like you get to explore a little bit. And for me, that's more about what makes Jack Ryan tick and kind of have that thing. And for my Matt Drake books, I write, my editor, Tom, said that when you come to a genre and you're a new writer, what you want to do is bring something that's the same but different. And so the same from the standpoint of, if you're shelved, in my case, next to Mark Graney or Brad Taylor or Vince Flynn or Kyle Mills, and you pick my book up and you read it, you say, yeah, I understood why he was shelved there, but Brad Taylor writes a really good Brad Taylor book. I'll never be able to write or do what he does, so I have to bring something different. And so for me, I made Nelson DeMille is another one of my huge influences, and especially his John Corey character. And so my Matt Drake books are really witty. It's a first-person protagonist. He works for the Defense Intelligence Agency, not the CIA or anything else. And so I tried to make some choices that were different, that then gave me some things to build on. So every time you come back to it, there's a little bit more that you want to explore. From a practical standpoint, what that looks like is I when I'm in the writing phase, I try and do about 2,500 words a day, which isn't every day and isn't constantly, but I end up writing probably 6 days a week. And I think one of the magic parts, Stephen King's got that seminal book called On Writing, about writing. And, one of the things he talks about, yep, exactly. One of the things he talks about in there that just really resonated with me is how much writing is, I think he calls it like a blue collar job, that you sit in a chair and you write stuff. But then he says, the magic part happens where if you're faithful to write every day or nearly every day, then when you're, at the gym or taking the dog for a walk, your subconscious is still working on something and it gives you that answer that you've been looking for. And so I think writing is kind of equal parts having faith that future you is going to figure out a way to solve present you's problems. But the only way future you gets a chance is if present you actually puts words on the page. And so it's pretty crazy right now, I'll be honest with you, but I think it's also, how many times do you get an opportunity to do that? And I feel like it's my chance to do it. And so I'm going to try and do it as long as I can.
I love that.
Great. Well,
all right. Well, let's have a drink. And before we go, we've got a final question for you.
Absolutely.
Yes. So we asked this of all our authors. Which of your characters would you like to share a meal with, and what would it be?
Well, I think that's a 2-part for me, because I would definitely like to share a meal with Matt Drake, because he's a lot funnier than I am. Like what he can say in the moment takes me several drafts.
Takes you 5 months.
Man, if I would only said this. And, he lives in Austin, Texas, like me, so I think it would be barbecue, probably Cooper's barbecue, for sure. Yes,
No.
yes. This big old slab of brisket.
Yeah, there you go.
From the Clancy universe, John Clark is he was a tough bad guy before tough bad guys were in favor. In fact, the Clancy book that seems to be everybody's favorite is his origin story. It's called Without Remorse. And so I would definitely like to share a meal with him. And I feel like since he's a SEAL, we'd have to eat seafood. So which I'd be okay with, but
yeah, that's awesome.
That's
Gotta
great.
gotta
That's
keep
great. Well,
everybody happy in both.
exactly.
Yeah. So
Yep.
when our readers want to find out about both of your series,
Yep.
how do they best reach out to you? Is email or social media? Where are you usually?
Yeah, so my website is donbentley.books.com, just DONBENTLEY books.com. And so you can figure out everything I'm working on there and sign up for my newsletter and read about both series. Or if you're a Twitter or Facebook first person, my handle is at Bentley Don B, just at BENTLEYDONB. So I love talking to readers. I love engaging with folks on social media. I love hearing what people have to say. So please find me.
Awesome.
Or else I'll be lonely.
Lonely but busy.
Well,
Lonely
thank you
but
so
busy.
much. I mean, yeah, he's so busy, and now
Fit
we're
us
making
in
him
and a beer.
drink, so he's just gonna probably write some interesting stories later. But anyway, thank you so much. And I feel like the only thing we have to do now is do a big cheers for 2 books coming out in the last 2
Cheers
months.
to you, Don.
Cheers.
Thank you. Cheers to you.